Hello, dear listeners. Thank you for expressing an interest in our work. My name is Andrea Vesoni. I'm an associate professor in media studies at the Faculty of Social Sciences, University of Ljubljana. The co-author of this paper is my colleague Tanja Kamin, and she comes from the same institution. The paper that I'm going to present today is entitled "The Hazard of Counting the Chickens Before They are Hatched. How Ready Are Consumers for Upscaling Flexitarianism?" In this talk, I'm going to present basically what are the preliminary results of a qualitative study that we did on young Slovene flexitarians. And we were interested primarily in the attitudes they have towards some novel foods they're prospecting to be part of our diets in the future. We focus especially on in vitro meat and insects. But before I present the results, let me explain a little bit about the contextual frame in which we anchor our research. So basically, in the past decade or so, there's basically established a current, what I call a current hegemonic discourse on animal proteins, that it's coming from major actors or agents in the field, namely the World Economic Forum, the UN, especially the FAO, World Health Organization, EAT-Lancet, and lately even European Commission's Green Deal. Me and my colleague Kamin already wrote about these discourses in another context. You're free to check it out in the link. So what is the basic problem all these actors emphasize? First of all, they emphasize the impact of animal agriculture, especially of mass livestock farming, because it heavily impacts the environment. We already know about that. I'm not going to further explain this. Then they're emphasizing the overconsumption of meat and its negative impact on human health, because we know we have general safety issues such as, salmonella, but also issues related to hormone overuse and antibiotics overuse. Then they all emphasize the global population growth and the development of the third world countries, and the problem that comes with it, it's related to meat consumption. Third world countries that are now known not to be so heavy meat eaters are becoming, will be, better to say, more and more, let's say, as they develop, more and more inclined towards a heavy meat diet. While on the other hand, the Western diet is already very much meat-based. For instance, in Slovenia, we consume 92 or 93 kilos per person per year of meat, while in the other countries such as United States, this ratio is even higher. It goes up to 124 kilos per person per year. So what will basically happen is that the decrease of meat consumption in these developed countries, it's not fast enough, while the increase of consumption of meat in the third world countries, it's rising very fast. So these actors all somehow emphasize we will be facing a food, or better a protein security risk in the very near future. So what are the solutions they propose? They mainly say that the development of alternative protein sources is one of the best solutions to kind of decrease meat consumption and switch meat with other, let's say, analogs. Along with this, they also propose investing in biotechnological solutions such as in vitro meat products, plant-based meat analogs. These are, second generation plant-based meat analogs, which are more highly processed and which are kind of developed on the basis of high-tech procedure, but also insects. And third, they also propose that consumers should basically change their eating habits towards switching plant-based or whatever alternative protein from for meat, that it's now still the main protein. Animal proteins are still the main proteins we consume in terms of quantity. So what is the state of the art of the industry? Basically, I want to speak about this very much in a nutshell because it's still relating to the context we are working in. So basically, new industries are being created, focusing on development of high-tech plant-based meat analogs, also in vitro meat and insects. Traditional, especially US meat industries such as Tyson and Smithfield, are putting on the market meat analogs, but also which are plant-based, but also they are investing in vitro meat. So the plant-based protein market and also the in vitro meat market is estimated to grow in the next decade or so, and this is kind of prospected to be a very large market. So, but the main issue for the industry, but also for the policymakers lately, is that how to prepare consumers to change their meat-based diets and embrace new foods, especially those that might be the most skeptical of, like in vitro meat and insects. So we kind of wanted to look at this, at the consumer's relations to what we call altogether the category of novel foods. Novel foods are, from the definition of the European Commission, foods that had not been consumed to a significant degree by humans in EU before 1997, when the first regulation on novel foods came into force. Novel food can be newly developed, innovative food produced using new technologies and production processes, as well as food which is or has been traditionally eaten outside the EU. Our research focused on two groups of these novel foods. One is insects, and this is already somehow to a certain point being regulated in the European Union, and the other one is in vitro meat, who is not yet, of course, in the market and in the European Union, but is kind of legalized for consumption elsewhere, for instance, for now only in Singapore, as far as I know. So studies show that consumers are generally not willing to reduce meat consumption and are very skeptical towards plant-based protein sources, but even more towards in vitro meat and above all towards insects. And these are many studies. Here you can see just a few that speak about it. But if we look closer at the study done by Buick in 2020, they say that approximately 65% of EU consumers claimed that they have already or stopped eating red meat, this was only for red meat, or reduced its intake, or they're planning to reduce it in a short period of time, mainly because of environmental reasons. On average, according to this study, on average 10% of EU consumers are willing to replace meat with insects, and 13.4% are willing to replace meat by in vitro meat, while about 20% are quite unsure what to do or what are they prepared to do. So basically, we wanted to look at this special category, which is a young flexitarian, and I will shortly explain the methodological frame of this study. But the point is to look at young people that are always, according to studies, more open towards food novelties. They're more open towards changes and changing their diet. So this was the group of consumers that interested us. We basically also chosen people that said they already reduce meat, so that for them it was not a hypothetical situation, but it was something that happened in their diets in the last 12 months. But let's define a flexitarian first. So according to Degvos, who is a scholar from Wageningen, he defines flexitarian as a person who reduces meat portion size, replaces parts of meat in, or this is alternatively, replaces part of the meat in meat-based products with plant-based alternatives, namely hybrid meats, consumes meat substitutes, so vegan burgers, various kinds of plant-based meat analogs, replaces meat with other animal or non-animal proteins. It could be something plant-based, it could be eggs or milk. Leaves out meat from the dish without replacing it, or replaces meat with environmental and animal-friendly alternatives. And some of these categories might even overlap. So, according also to Degvos and other scholars, the category of flexitarians is very under-researched. And until now, researchers mainly focused on other categories, which were mainly vegans or meat eaters. What were the research questions in our study? This is only a small part of the whole study, because this, let's say, focus on novel foods was only a small part of this study. We asked the participants to share their views on experiences concerning many other aspects, which were flexitarian identity, meat analogs, plant-based meat analogs, meat reduction, meat consumption, meal planning, eating out, preparing meals at home, influence of significant others on meat consumption, motivations for meat reduction, ethical eating, and the influence of COVID-19 on meat consumption. And I might also skipped some of it because these interviews were really long. So back to the research questions. So research question 1 was, what are the main motives for meat reduction among Slovene youth who pursue a flexitarian diet? Because we only focus on Slovene youth at this point. And the second one was, what are the main attitudes of young Slovene flexitarians in relation to novel foods, namely in vitro meat and insects? We are well aware that these two categories of in vitro meat and insects are very different. And I will then, when I will report the results, I will also emphasize these differences. But for the sake of this presentation, we just merged them in one, let's say, paper. So what was the methodology behind it? We were engaged in a qualitative study on flexitarians. So we did 15 in-depth interviews via Zoom because of the lockdown during June to September 2021. The length of the interview was on average 2.20 minutes, 2 hours and 20 minutes, and the interviews were transcribed verbatim and anonymized, of course. We believe the saturation was reached, but only towards the very end, so it might be that we will continue collecting data just to make sure. The sample was very heterogeneous in terms of demographic variables covered. So age, social status, place of living, which means rural or urban in Slovenia, gender, education, profession, and type of household. The data were then analyzed with MaxQDA 2020 software, and we did an inductive analysis to first of all see what the data are telling us. The recruitation criteria was only one. We said that we need people or individuals of age 18 to 35 who reduced meat and fish consumption during the last 12 months. So let me report a little bit on the results. First of all, we identified quite some motives for becoming flexitarian. Some of them were very obvious, such as protecting the environment, environmental welfare, health and body image, but some of them were more, let's say, curious somehow. So when it comes to environmental protection, most of the subjects said it mattered to them. In contrast to animal welfare, where for some subjects was important and for other subjects was not important at all. For some of them, health and body image was very important. They wanted to stay healthy, so they mainly reduced meat because of it, and they wanted to have a lean body, and they believed that meat is fattening them. Some of them also said that meat is too heavy to digest, so this was the main reason they cut it out quite a bit from their diet. Adaptability and flexibility is another very interesting motive. So people, instead of stop eating meat completely, they kind of reduced meat, but they still wanted to stay flexible. So in cases of a social situation in which they would have to eat meat, or they would feel they have to eat meat because they, had dinner with friends or families who were predominantly meat eaters, they still wanted to kind of be safe and allow themselves to eat meat, even though occasionally. Then some reported that their unskillness of cooking meat was the main factor they stopped eating meat, or at least reduced it. Some of them said that meat prices were too high, and this was the main reason they kind of cut down meat. And some of them just said they have an aversion towards meat since they were very little, that they never even really liked meat, and that now that they can, they kind of stopped or reduced its consumption. What were the main facilitating factors for becoming a flexitarian from being a meat eater? First of all, peer influence. People who said, the majority of our subjects said that peer influence was very important for them, that they knew somebody, a significant other, who became vegan, vegetarian, or flexitarian, and they needed to somehow follow them. Then also distancing from their parental diets. So if the parents were meat eaters, they kind of said that they felt the urge to distance themselves from their parents' diet, but this was only possible when they moved to a separate household. So they were no longer cooking and eating in the same household as their parents. Then culinary curiosity. These subjects kind of are people who are very curious. They want to experiment with food. They like to cook themselves, and they like to cook ethnical food. And they don't see meat to be a major component in that culinary experiments, or somehow, or what can we maybe call it? Another major factor was media influence. Quite some subjects reported that they changed their mind or reflected on their diets when they saw a certain documentary on, let's say, livestock pollution, or let's say green gas emissions, and so on and so forth. And quite some said that COVID-19 and the lockdown kind of gave them the opportunity to stay at home and cook meals at home instead of eating out, and that this kind of facilitated their transition toward meat reduction. So, flexitarians' attitudes in relation to in vitro meat, we identified, and insects, we identified, I think, nine let's say, categories of flexitarians' attitudes. So, what they think of in vitro meat and insects. First of all, we have those disinterested. So, people who are not interested in any kind of, let's say, alternative proteins or alternative meat in terms of in vitro meat and insects. They just don't miss the meaty taste of food, and they just don't feel kind of they want it, they crave it. They just said they don't need it and that veggies can entirely satisfy their needs. Then we had those who we named disgusted. So people who, this was related to mainly to insects, because this was people who were kind of hooked by this, let's say, yuck factor that that was very predominant when we asked them if they what they feel about eating, how they feel about eating insects in the future. Then we have overcomers, people who were in essence kind of, you know, not very, let's say, happy about eating insects, but they said this should be a rational, not an emotional decision, and that they are kind of prepared to overcome this aversion towards insects by tasting them and I don't know, reevaluating their let's say attitudes towards it. Then we have the skeptics, so those that do not completely trust in vitro meat. They feel they need more information. They feel it might not be healthy, but they don't know yet. So there's a lot of hesitation towards in vitro meat. Then we have normalizers, those who would eat in vitro meat and insects once they become a regular part of our diets, because this is reassuring for them in terms of let's say food safety. They feel it's going to be tested enough. People are going to eat it massively, so they don't fear any kind of, I don't know, health hazards. Then we have traditionalists, those who see meat as those who choose actually meat over in vitro meat, although they are meat reducers, those who kind of advocate for natural, whole, organic, local products, and they feel that lab-grown meat is just artificial and somehow science fiction and absurd. Then we have the progressivists, people who have no problem about the unnaturalness of these products. They say the term natural is even overrated, or is kind of used for marketing, that many things are not natural, so they feel that, let's say, high-tech processed food are still good to eat and are part of our future developments. Then we have the ethicists. These are those consumers who are concerned about animal welfare, even though if this is insects welfare, and those who are also concerned about the environment, and saying that if these novel foods will save the environment, they are willing to eat it. And then we have the conditionalists, so those who would eat in vitro meat, but if sold at a reasonable price, if it would taste good, if it becomes a regular diet in terms of massive consumption, and if the insects, for instance, would be disguised in food, so hidden somehow. They don't want to see a whole, let's say, worm or whatever, whole insect and eat it. So let me jump to conclusions. So flexitarians are a very heterogeneous group of meat reducers. They're somehow non-identitary. They distance themselves a lot from the vegan identity because they find the vegan lifestyle or diet too rigid, and they find vegans too militant somehow. But some of them also aspire to become vegan, but not in a political sense, but more in terms of, let's say, protecting animal welfare and the environment. So they kind of want to cut out meat completely. In general, flexitarianism, as revealed in our data, seems to be more of an intimate project than a political one. But subjects were somehow still aware of the impact of their diets on the environment and animal welfare. So, especially respondents who engage in flexitarianism for health reasons and care for individual body perceive flexitarianism as a totally individualistic project. The most important influencer in meat reduction seems to be gained independence from primary family, along with a desire to distance oneself from the traditional Slovene meat-based cuisine. Flexitarians also embraced novel foods, but they were at the same time hesitant towards them. So somehow they kind of embrace the idea of these high-tech, let's say futuristic meat substitutes, but on the other hand, they seem quite hesitant towards saying that they would kind of embrace it totally in terms of incorporating these novel foods on daily basis in their diets. So yeah, I think I'm over time already. So openness to this non-traditional food and novelties in cooking ingredients and techniques and ethical considerations of food choices are typical of food practices which are usually related to more liberal worldviews and people's higher cultural, social and economic capital. But we will have to test this further with a survey. So reducing meat consumption and substituting meat with novel protein alternatives can be seen as a food practice that on one hand contradicts prevailing meat-based diets in Slovenia, and also an embracement of discourses on ethical eating and a continuation of one's identification as a good citizen. But unlike vegan identities, flexitarianism offers a choice for both challenging or reinforcing prevailing values and ideologies. It can contradict but also play along practices that already exist in terms of meat consumption in Slovenia. So flexitarians, they integrate the privileged and unprivileged food practices alike from different standpoints, and in this they kind of perhaps have the potential to transform the culinary landscape, especially because they are meat reducers. So thank you for listening. We welcome your questions and comments. Please write to the email you can see on the screen, and we can maybe continue this discussion if you want to. Thank you.